Let's get started, shall we? First of all, afternoon, everyone. Just afternoon, and welcome to AO Hosts an audience with Amitai Schleier. So AO are on a mission to be the global destination for electricals. We're a e-commerce organisation based in the northwest of England, and we are growing rapidly. Now, you may have seen some of our smiley green vans driving up and down the country, delivering everything from PlayStations to ovens. And you may even have that earworm of a AO Let's Go theme tune stuck in your head from the TV adverts. So at AO, we believe that you should treat every customer like your nan. And I'm often asked, what's our version of Agile? And it's just following a similar principle, really. Our 26 development teams are obsessed about the customer experience. So whether that be a customer on our website or the customer in the call center for which we're writing the software for, or even just consumers of the data that we make available through the organization. In fact, big shout out to Sarah Norris, our front-end developer, for allowing you as customers to this event to post a question to Amitai, which we'll be asking at the end of his talk. So throughout this year, AO Tech are going to be hosting some of the biggest names in the industry. Being completely honest, to help grow our own people, but to also share that knowledge and insight with the wider community. This session is going to be recorded, and the link will be shared with everyone that's registered for this event. And we'll work through the questions that you posted at the end of this talk. So let's get underway. I'm pleased and proud to hand over to world-class software development coach and host of Agile in 3 Minutes, Amitai Schleier.
Thank you, Dave. Very kind. I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks for joining me, and thanks AO for bringing us together. I'm going to share my slides. How's that look? I sound good? I look good?
Yeah.
All right. Groove, as good as I'm going to be able to look today. That's for sure. Hi, I'm Amitai. I'm a software development coach, and I'm here today to share with you some of what I've learned so far. We've all felt joy and humanity in software development, at least sometimes. Our work goes better when we do, and when we don't, thoughtful changes can bring it back to us. But wait, joy, humanity, this past year has been full of lessons and tests. Sometimes when more of your personal life shows up on camera, that makes someone's day. And sometimes what makes someone's day is when you help them assert boundaries around their personal lives. It's been a year in which we again could have learned that the way we've designed to live together and work together is not equitable enough. And that while some of us feel it more acutely, all of us live with the loss. This year, defined by universal loss, could have been the one where we started to figure all this out. Maybe it was. In any case, we've got a long road ahead. All the more reason for this talk. Today, I'll tell some stories of a different before and after, one that's already happened, connected by a much shorter road. It's like this. I've felt two entirely different ways while doing software development, and both were in the same job. I went from nervous and disoriented to confident and connected. It happened slowly, as you'd imagine, over time. But what changed how I felt in my work? What changed how people whose reputations were intertwined felt about their work? And what changed how people depending on our product related to us? Lots of small factors and one big one. Goldratt, in his theory of constraints, asserts that the throughput of a system is always constrained by a bottleneck. If you find it, you can ease it. If you ease it enough, someplace else in the system becomes the new bottleneck. In any system of collaborative software development, a deeply human endeavor, I find it useful to posit that the bottleneck is human relationships. So far, this assumption has never led me astray. Now, I don't think this, as stated, is an unusual or rare opinion. On the contrary, I think most organizations that do some software development would agree. It's just that our agreement would probably be rather shallow. The preponderance of software development being done today is designed with the assumption that the way to ease the human relationships bottleneck is to reduce our reliance on human relationships. The more specialized the results, the fewer and more controlled the interactions, the better the result. If that were working well, I promise you, I would try really, really hard to believe it. If reality looked like that, I hope I would consider adjusting my beliefs. My claim, from my experience, is the opposite. I believe the way to ease the bottleneck in software development is to honor, strengthen, and grow human relationships. I don't think this is an unusual or rare opinion either. Less common, not uncommon. But of all the ways we could come at it, how is best? Let's begin, as I did, with legacy code. I love how this disappears or not. It's great. Our vocabulary on this topic owes a great deal to Michael Feathers, who's working effectively with legacy code, defines it as code without tests. His definition has been tremendously useful in a field where the value of automated tests is still far from universally understood. But while tests are a means to confidence, they're not the only means, and certainly not an end in themselves. So my favorite working definition of legacy code is valuable code we're afraid to change. This means whether some code is legacy depends on who's trying to live with it. It's a function of code and people combined. For more on this, check out Jessica Kerr on Semathecy and G. Paw Hill on made, making, and makers. For today, let's just note that code has plenty of its own properties, but not legacyness. That's a property of the relationship between code and its humans. Legacy is usually seen as an indicator that joy is absent, but that's not necessarily so. Some of us particularly enjoy the challenges of wrestling with legacy code. It can be especially satisfying, like I'll share with you today, when we get to live in a code base long enough to change our relationships to it and to other people. And some of us get a kick out of it in any case. Listen to Andrea Goulet on Makers and Menders. Most code and human relationships are at least a little bit legacy, and most workplaces are at least a little bit joyless and inhumane. The stable equilibrium for workplaces, the state they on average tend to get into and stay in, seems worse than that. High-performing teams, delighted customers, and emotionally satisfying interactions are in unstable equilibrium. When you get there, the slightest entropy tends to pull you away. You can hold that equilibrium, though. It just takes ongoing, concerted, shared effort. When everyone is pulling together, the energy you expend will be returned to you, and then some. By the end of this talk, I hope you'll have a stronger sense about where to focus that energy and a stronger feeling that it's worth the trouble. I'd like to tell you a few stories. They're about me. It's okay, I have my permission. I was a newly minted university graduate, 30 years old. It took me a couple tries. Music degree, not computer science. And it was New York, 2009. The market was pretty bad. I really needed work because I had a huge college loan. That's the way it is in America. And I had New York rent. That's the way it is in New York. And I was lucky, extremely, and that's going to come up over and over again today, that I had friends at a bank who were world-leading experts in IT security. And for some reason, the only reason I can think of is the conversations we had while drinking beer when I was in college. For some reason, they thought I could help them with some software that they had written. The software they had written was a proof of concept. It was written at one of their apartments over a weekend. Alcohol was again involved. It was Perl. There was a lot of copying and pasting, but that's okay. It's a proof of concept. And what they wanted to prove was that they could solve a very thin slice of a very complicated and very important identity management problem at this bank. And my friends could do this because they were good programmers and because they had distributed administrative access over all the Unix machines at the company and all the Kerberos realm that they were trying to deal with. Kerberos was the area they were in. I don't know anything about that stuff. I'm just beginning to, years later, understand how much they understood. But what they had was a successful proof of concept. It did solve that slice of the problem. It was much, much, much better end-to-end than the manual process that existed before. And as soon as they became aware that this was going to be a multi-year software product management situation, they were looking for somebody to hand it off to. They had other plans for their careers, and I just wanted to have a job. So at least in that sense, they were right. I would be willing to try. And they had confidence in me. I didn't share that confidence, not yet. I had been a programmer once before. It had been 7 years before. And I hadn't been that good at it then. I had done some open source work, and I had encountered some important ideas. I'd been very lucky again. So here's what happened in this first story. I arrived at this workplace. My friends had the system that was running. And now that we have a system of record that can maintain and update these identities, sometimes an identity goes out of its life cycle, it exits its scope, and we should give our tool a way to mark that for the ID, not to delete it for identity management reasons, but to disable it so it can't be used. And that my friends made this easy for me. The schema changes that would have been required had already been baked into the original schema. So I didn't even have to figure that out. But I did have to figure out there's a server, there's a client, they talk to each other, there's a network transport, there's authentication, there's remote procedure calls, marshalling, unmarshalling, there's object-oriented Perl, which surprised me and now is something that I love, but at the time didn't know what to make of it. And so I had examples to follow. I could copy paste in the server how to implement a new subcommand. I could copy paste in the client the same. I could see how to manipulate the database and make that work. And I could even test some of the integration points with the backend systems that made this actually function. What I couldn't do, because I did not have distributed administrative access at this company, which was good, I should not have had it and would not have wanted to be given it. I couldn't test all those integrations for provisioning in different systems and deprovisioning in those systems. But I could, I could hope that I did okay. Now, just before we went production with this basic new feature, I had an amazing insight, which is that now that we can have IDs that are marked disabled in our database, probably some other commands want to work differently depending on whether an ID is disabled or not. And my friend said, yep, that's right. Yep. Yep. And so I went through all the other features, which I did not understand very well because the domain language was really opaque. We didn't have any automated tests of any kind to illustrate how people would use it. So for example, there was a create command, which that sounds like something that I would understand how to use, and I should. But then there was an insert command, which I was told was not allowed. Only operations can do that. Okay. And there's assert, which is how, if there's an ID from before we had this tool where we don't have any ownership information about it, assert is how you could claim over the period of a week that this one should become yours. Makes sense. But then the way that you short circuit that, if you urgently need to take ownership, is called accuse, which sounds like something that you should never do, but it was something that you should sometimes do. And then there was update, which makes perfect sense. You have metadata, you want to update it, run update. Cool. But then there were specific other subcommands for specific kinds of updates. And I just knew that I didn't have the whole picture. And I knew that I didn't understand the life cycle of who's using this tool and why and when and how. So that's the context I was in. So I add all those where clauses to all those other features. Now that disabled is a state. We go to production, and it's the oldest story in the world if you're a software developer. The new feature worked fine, and a bunch of other stuff broke. I feel like if Joseph Campbell had a mythology of software archetypes, then Joseph Campbell 2.0 would start with this story. We've all experienced it. New thing worked, old stuff broke all the time. So, we scrambled. We looked at what these errors were. They were really, really basic because I was really, really rusty at programming. They were missing spaces in these multi-line SQL statements or incorrect quoting. Think like I couldn't exercise those code paths. That might have been okay if I was much more in shape as a programmer, but I wasn't. And it passed review. A lot of good that did. So it was quick to fix. We had an emergency fix on Tuesday. This is not what banks like to do on a Tuesday, but it's better than keeping things broken in production. And as soon as we had things sorted out, I went home, I took a deep breath. I thought about how scared I was about my job because I really needed to keep it. And I tried to remember if there's anything I know or have heard of or just, brain, what do you got for not being so crappy at programming right about now? And what popped into my head, because I was lucky in my first job, is test-driven development. Now, I had never learned it that well the first time, but I had a suspicion that's what I was going to need. So I went to Bill, that's my friend who was the manager. I said, Bill, if you need me to not screw up in production like that again. And Bill says, go on, yes. I said, then I think I need to do test-driven development. And I don't know if he knows what that was. I don't know if he knew what that was. He does now. But he just said, listen, man, do whatever you think you need. So I had a green light, but it didn't mean I could go do that. I didn't know how to do it that well, and our code wasn't in a state where I could. The relationship was legacy. So what we could do, I was lucky, is I still had these domain experts. Both of my friends who had written this code were there. And at any given time, at least two of us were working to decouple the remote procedure call and the marshalling and unmarshalling from the business logic. And we didn't have a lot of tests. We did eventually have some end-to-end tests, so I could see the life cycle, but nothing that could exercise granularly what's going on here. So the way we mitigated that is always work together and make tiny mechanical changes together, one at a time, tiny commits, and then exercise manually every way we can think of at each step. And at the end of that, it was a few months of work. At the end of that, we had a system where the network transport had already been its own layer, authentication had already been its own layer. Now, remote procedure call was its own layer. And all we had in our business logic was our business logic. It was really just objects that we could call methods on. And at this point, it was possible to write microtests. So this is where the next story starts to begin. From this point on, anytime I had a new feature, it was test-driven development as I understood it, which was very basic at the time, with an additional step. Step 0 was first, this is existing code. I'm probably going to change it. Is the part of code that I'm going to change already covered by test? And to begin with, the answer was always no. So step 0 was to cover it with tests. And then either you add new tests for new nuances or you change existing tests if the behavior is supposed to change and make them be true. And over time, more and more tests. After about 6 months, the answer in general of is the stuff I'm about to change already covered started to be yes. And that was kind of a game changer. So in this story, this is a last minute feature. At this point, we were releasing about every half a year because the pain of the release process could only be overcome that often by the pain of the inventory of the features that we had accumulated. The release process was not fun. It involved freezing at least a week in advance. Don't cut it so close. Explaining exactly what's going to be in the release, and then getting arbitrarily high management approval or arbitrarily high management veto. Not always with a reason that you would be lucky to get. So, and also the place that this code was being deployed to wasn't any ordinary servers. It was the Kerberos servers. There were about 12 around the world. Our code runs as root. If I make the right mistake, nobody and nothing can log into anything. This company won't exist anymore if I make the right mistake. And so there were some gates to deployment, and they were, under the circumstances, justifiable. So it was coming up on one of our every half a year releases. These were done on Fridays because at a bank, Friday night in New York, close of business, to Sunday Hong Kong open of business is your biggest window to mess with production in case you screw it up. So Friday nights are when you get to deploy. It's pretty fun. So it was a Friday. It was a Friday of half of the year that we're going to do a release for. And that morning, Bill called me and he said, I got a feature request. It wasn't really a request. I tried to say no, it didn't work. It's also not a very good feature. That's why I tried to say no. But if there's any way you could squeeze it in for tonight, that would be amazing. And I said, tell me more about this feature. So what didn't make sense about it, there were at least two ways it didn't make sense. One, it interacted confusingly with existing primitives in our tool. And so I think users would have been confused by it. And the second way is that our tool was designed to encourage people to make better choices about security. And this never would have encouraged anything like that. So we had strong suspicions that it would fit badly and it would bring no benefit. That's why Bill tried to say no. So I said, Bill, come back in an hour and a half and let's look at some tests. I'm going to write tests for all the weird edge cases I can think of. You'll review them with me. And if you agree that's how this weird feature has to work, I'll try to make them pass and see if everything else is still okay. An hour and a half later, he reviewed them with me. We agreed this feature is really dumb, but that's exactly how it has to work. And 45 minutes later, the new test passed and nothing else was broken. So we deployed it, and whichever big shot that was, I'm sure was happy, and I'm sure it helped Bill. And 3 years later, we decommissioned that feature because it had never helped anybody, and that was satisfying for me to delete that code. But what really stuck out is the change in relationship for me. First of all, not just that I can keep my job, but that I can, we have some agility now. When we have a last minute request that we want to accommodate for some value of want, we can safely. And then my relationship with Bill, who went from probably a pretty big lack of confidence in me to maybe more confidence than he had thought he could expect from a programmer. What that leaves is who's deploying this code. I'm sad to say, as you might expect at a bank. Oh, one more key detail about this story. We shipped this code, it went in production, everything was fine. Bill came to me and said, Amitai, I don't think I have the discipline to write tests first, but I'm really glad you do. Which has stuck with me, as you can tell. So this is an example that may be useful to you at some point in your careers, is that managers' interests and developers' interests can be aligned when they have visibility into the same things and safety from the same things. We'll come back to it. But what he said really stuck with me. It said, I'm on the right track, keep going. And so I thought, now my relationship with myself at work is better, my relationship with my manager at work is better. What's the next relationship I could improve? It came to me. This story is called continual delivery because we couldn't do continuous. But at this point, we were shipping once a month onto the Kerberos servers, down from every 6 or sometimes every 3, because the operations team had grudgingly given us permission. Once a month, whatever's green on the main branch. We know you guys run a lot of automated tests. Okay. But one time, a release that they had rejected, a release that they had accepted, at the last minute, they rejected. And I, as a newly minted people manager, got really, really angry. I think this was exacerbated because I had someone that I was responsible for on my team who had unnecessarily but diligently pulled an all-nighter to finish something he really wanted to get into the release. And the reason the release was rejected was because there were going to be 2 lines in the operations wiki on their run book that were going to change slightly because of the way the new code worked. And I figured on Friday nights when we release, we're on the phone with them for 3 to 5 hours, making sure it goes right. Really wasn't fun. And I figure in 5 minutes, somewhere in there, I'll be able to edit their wiki and update these 2 lines. I knew that, but they didn't know that. What they knew is the details that should have been carefully checked beforehand that they knew how to see did not look like they had been carefully checked. And that's what they knew how to see. So they said, as far as we know, this is not a carefully prepared release. You haven't thought through all the implications. Now we reject. And I got so mad. I yelled at that IT operations manager. I know that didn't help. It didn't help. Didn't feel good, but it's what I wanted to do in that moment. And I did. And then I had all weekend to think about this. And it didn't take all weekend to figure out what I hoped would happen next. What I hoped would happen next, and I didn't deserve it, but I was hoping anyway, is that this IT operations manager, Luke, would forgive me when I would apologize, and then that he would be willing to pair program with me on a feature that week. And to his enormous credit, he was willing to do both. So it happened. We had the same release scheduled for the following Friday, and on Wednesday, in came a small behavior change request. And I thought, this is perfect. On Thursday, Luke and I were in a conference room. He had his own checkout of our code. I showed him how to run the tests. They're green. We whiteboarded how this new behavior would interact because he supported this product. He knew all about it. I showed him where in the tests, I would write some tests to indicate what we had just agreed. Those are red, cool. And then here's where in the application I would go to make it green. If you've done test-driven development, this is what it's like. And it was green. And we were about to commit. And I said, hold on a second. We've just been running the tests that are in the immediate vicinity of this feature. Let's run the whole suite just in case. And some other stuff broke. Not because the tests were brittle or overly coupled, but because there were side effects that we had forgotten about, but our system remembered it for us. And again, this is burned into my memory. The room we were sitting in, the level of the light, the color of the text on the screen, and the look on Luke's eyes. The look on Luke's eyes was, aha, you will never make this mistake in production. You will never make this mistake in integration. You'll never make this mistake in any environment. It's never even going to get committed. You fix this kind of stuff before you commit. Now I get it. And from then on, the next day, that feature shipped with his name on it that he had written the day before. And from then on, for 3.5 years, we had monthly releases with whatever was green on main on Friday. We would leave operations a couple hours to package it up, but that's it. They knew that of all the ways that various IT products were going to get them in trouble on those Kerberos servers, it was never going to be us. And it fundamentally changed our relationship with operations. We couldn't be organizationally connected like that, but we could behave as though we were. And we did. I'm going to do a slightly short version of this one. So far, we're shipping once a month onto Kerberos servers, a pretty low budget, small product. It's a linchpin in the system, but it's a small piece of code. And observers were kind of mildly interested in what we're doing because it was different. It wasn't like prepare a release plan, delay until you hit that release plan, freeze more than 1 week in advance, get those approvals. It was totally different. But I knew that it consisted of discipline, but observers might not have known that yet. And so it was interesting, but it wasn't directly mappable into their experience. Then we got assigned a project, and projects are very familiar at a company like this. And the short version of this is where we picked up Scrum. At this point, we were expanding outward from living effectively with our code to needing to predict because we had a hard deadline at September 30th, 2011. I remember it really well. And we were given the project in January. And with a little bit of Scrum, with point estimates and a burn down chart, we were able to, because our code was healthy, because we had learned our domain really well, because we had tests, because we've been shipping incrementally, we were in a position where, given a project, we had a chance. And we had a chance because we could think of the right stories, probably. And we could estimate them pretty well, probably. And we could start working down the list and see if we had a chance with our burn down to hit the deadline. And all of those things worked out really well. And the one time they didn't, we had an upstream dependency that tried to change the game on us. I was able to use the burn down to get my manager at the time, who did not care about me as a person whatsoever, but understood that his positional power was needed, to go use it. And that got us back on schedule. And we shipped that project with 5 minutes to spare before the deadline. And we knew the whole time that we were going to be okay. Now, what makes this story especially interesting is what happens after, or before the end. It was about a month and a half left to go. And my team are nose down on this project. We're doing nothing else. Nothing else that could ever go into this product is on our radar. We have one backlog, one project. That's it. And, we're nose to the grindstone. We're going to maybe make it. Then a month and a half before that deadline, before our deadline, I hear from a valued colleague in IT security that he's suddenly been given a deadline in his product. It's the same deadline. And he needs my product to improve its API to help him. And my immediate reaction was, sorry, dude, I don't have any idea how I'm going to be able to help you with that. I don't have time. But then, and this is another thing that almost never works, but it was able to work for us, we were offered to borrow a particular person for a week or two. And because of who the particular person was, I considered it seriously that it might work. This person, his name was Dan, had worked in IT security, did understand our product very well, knew how to write tests, knew how to write Perl, and I could trust him to understand how to align the interests in the situation. And what I asked him to do when I accepted the offer of borrowing Dan, I said, Dan, here's what I need from you. You and my colleague Murray go off and have all the design discussions you need to have. Leave me out. I don't have time. I trust you both. And when you're done, make a branch in our code base with red tests of the fewest things you can have me do that will help Murray get done what he needs to get done. And I don't know how long they discussed because they included me out, which was great. I just know that Dan gave me some tests, including he commented some of them out because he understood that implementing those would be more complicated and that we didn't have to have them. He had really done all the work. And in 2 hours on one afternoon, I was able to make all those tests green. And because we were shipping every month, a couple of weeks later, it was in production where Murray could be working against it. And he hit his deadline and we hit our deadline. And I can't think of any other way that could have worked. And this business outcome, which is maybe the most satisfying business interaction I've been able to have in my career, maybe, was only possible because we had the right people, and especially because we had the right way to relate these people to our code. That relationship was now the opposite of legacy. We could exploit it so that we could borrow somebody and have that pay off. That never pays off, but it paid off. So those are the stories for today. Thank you for joining me for story time. Now, those are my stories, but there's no one right way to move toward joy and humanity in software development. I started with solo TDD and expanded outward, and I adapted to broader contexts over time. But to invest in code and in process and in working relationships, you can start anywhere, anytime. The only sure way to keep your situation less adaptive is to not adapt it. By contrast, there are many, many paths that lead toward joyful, humane software work. Here are your two main options. Option one, you can get serious about iterative incremental business involvement. And you'll quickly discover you weren't serious enough yet about iterative incremental development. Option 2, get good at delivering, and people will come asking what you could do for them next. You've just heard all about option 2, so let me expand a bit on option 1. Say you start with Scrum. Lots of places do. Scrum sets up a bunch of feedback loops you might be missing, including retrospectives. If you regularly retrospect, you can steer your process. If your retrospection sometimes goes a little meta, you'll be able to notice, tune, even create more feedback loops. Sometimes when I describe coaching, I describe it as rehabilitating an organization's feedback loops, finding where they've broken open and reclosing them so the org can once again steer itself. Scrum is a fine starting point. I do want to draw your attention as software people to the fact that Scrum, by design, says nothing specific about the software part of software product development. Scrum for software is an interface without an implementation. That doesn't mean it's a bad interface. It does mean our ability to adhere to that interface depends very, very heavily on implementation choices that are entirely up to us to discover, enact, defend, and improve. And here's the rub. In practice, almost nobody in charge of implementing Scrum knows to expect these software-specific difficulties, let alone where they'll be found, what they'll look like, and how to invest in overcoming them. And here's the meta rub. In practice, almost nobody in charge of software development knows how to look for the kinds of costs and risks that are specific and endemic to software development. Maybe because they assume it couldn't possibly be that different from any other kind of IT project. And here's the meta rub. In practice, almost nobody who's in charge and doesn't know what to look for is aware that their lack of awareness greatly magnifies those costs and risks to their Scrum implementation, sure, but more important, to their people and their business. I'm not bagging on Scrum. You just heard a story where it helped us ship the right increment at the right time. Do note the sequence in which we began applying Scrum, and note the context specificity with which we grabbed only the parts we needed next. I'm not bagging on software managers either. Most managers get thrown in with zero training, and software development is inherently hard to see. It's not reasonable to expect anyone to come magically equipped with knowledge about how to see it. None of us came that way. Scrum is a lens you can look through. It's a useful one, but a lens can only show us what we've learned how to see. Visual acuity comes from a finely tuned relationship between perception and processing. When that relationship is fuzzy, the picture is fuzzy. Until it's repaired, salient details will remain out of focus. That was option 1. Let's come back to option 2. When you want to be ready to change your body's direction, you take smaller steps, lower your center, concentrate on balance. That's agile. Don't be so optimizy about finding the maximally auspicious first step that you delay taking any step. Don't be too concerned about whether others will immediately want to join you. You can start where you are. Indeed, you have to. And you can start today with how you relate to your code. How can you and your code move more smoothly together? How can you and your code change direction more confidently together? When you notice that relationship has gotten stronger, take advantage of it. Look around. As developers in code who can now deliver as reliably and frequently as anyone around you could possibly deal with, and see which relationship you're now equipped to strengthen next, one bottleneck at a time. My wish for you is to be able to feel about your work the way I've sometimes been lucky to feel about mine. Or if you felt it before, to be able to feel it again. Or if you're feeling it now, for your influence to expand. This planet needs grown-ups whose work lives are brimming with justifiable enthusiasm, as many as we can get. There's no one right way to get there, but maybe investing in technical skills in order to improve human relationships can be the right way for you. Kent Beck was famously on a mission to make the world safe for programmers. More recently, he revised it to help geeks feel safe in the world. I believe the first step on this mission is to make the team safe for non-programmers. And I believe we unlock that possibility when we improve our relationship with our code. That's my message for you today. May your humanity be a source of competitive advantage, and may your joy in programming be extreme. Thank you.
Amitai, are you happy to jump straight into the questions now for Q&A round?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay. So we had about 35, 40 questions. We're going to get through as many as we can. So I'll start with who sent the question and what it is. So we've got Haria asked, in a team with people that believe that work and joy are completely separate topics, what should you do? Should you show what the possibilities are and how, or just go to a different team?
So I think a preface to every single question I answered today, every single answer I give, will be that as a consultant, I would love to know a lot more context about your situation and then give much more specific advice. But I'm a speaker today, so it's going to be a little generic. I hope that's okay. First of all, why would somebody believe that joy and work are at odds? I think there are valid reasons to think so. I have some advantages. I think I mentioned several times in this talk how lucky I am. One of them is that as someone who grew up with programming and loved programming, and even though I got a music degree, it wasn't so surprising that I got a programming job, who is white and a dude and sounds like this, I have some advantages of coming from joy and expecting to be able to live that out at work. And not everybody can reasonably expect that. And not everybody gets into programming because it gives them joy. A totally valid reason to get into this field is it gives you a livelihood that is reliable and pays well and lets you provide for a family. I think that's totally fine. I don't think everybody needs to love it as a kid the way that I loved it as a kid. On the other hand, I think a lot of people in any workplace, regardless of where they're coming from, have been taught that joy is not something reasonable to expect at work. Or if you have it, it's not something reasonable to display at work. And so you give two good options. I think it's Martin Fowler who always says, change your organization or change your organization. And those are your two options. Which one should you choose? I think it depends on how attached you are to the place that you're in. I would always try to show people that another way can exist, and how they react to that is going to be up to them. One more factor that I would think about is if we have a way to know, then I think my expectations would be different depending on these teammates think that joy and work are orthogonal to each other, they're at right angles, they're just not related, or they're opposites. And if I, for some reason, am able to know that they think that they're opposites, that's probably an uphill battle. But if they just think that they're independent variables, then we could probably surprise them.
Okay, next question. What are the key steps to influencing a high performance culture of software engineering in a team?
There are a lot. The single biggest one, in my experience, is showing people what is possible. That's one of the ways that I was lucky. In my first programming job as a college dropout, I had a friend and mentor put his name and reputation on the line to hire me and teach me himself. And it's a very special experience, very lucky. And I didn't really understand what they were doing, but I did know that the place that I landed was doing extreme programming. And I didn't know what that was better than. I didn't have any basis for comparison. What I did know is that like 1 in every 15 optimizations that these really smart people used made sense to me. And the other 15 I assumed would make sense to me when I was further along my journey. And what I took away a lot of things imprinted on me, including 7 years later, test-driven development would really be handy right about now. Other things I took away at that age that I really needed to learn were that these people are smarter than me to begin with, which is awesome. I really needed to learn that. And secondly, they're so much smarter that they understand how insufficient that fact is to do good work. And so what I could take away, even at my inability to see in detail, was these people were paying attention to how they did their work. They noticed where the mistakes and the slowdowns and the inconveniences came from, and they systematically, a little bit at a time, changed a habit or a tool or an environment or how they worked in some other way to systematically make fewer and fewer of those things they didn't want happen. And they were a high-performing team, and they had joy in the workplace, and I could at least detect that. So I think the single biggest thing that helped me in my journey to understand a high-performance team was seeing one. And then there are a ton of details after that, but that's the biggest one. You have to know what it can look like, that it exists, so you can have some kind of vague picture in your mind and some impetus to go after it.
Next one. Do you think 3 minutes is the shortest possible podcast, or did you think a 3-minute podcast might work?
Well, so this one is referencing my podcast, Agile in 3 Minutes, which is subtitled The Simplest Podcast That Could Possibly Work. And so I guess the question is, where do we put the parentheses in that subtitle? It's the simplest, it's the 3-minute length. I actually thought about doing 4 first. And then I thought, wait a minute, 4 minutes is a really long time. I'm going to do this every week. That's a really long time. Let's do 3. Let's see what I can do with 3. Shorter is probably possible. Longer is probably possible, but 3 is what I was able to sustain for the better part of a year.
Okay. What practices would you suggest to minimize waste and reduce the risk and cost of change?
I love this question. One of the things I learned in the job that I was talking about today was how to talk about the business value of technical practices. They give me a feeling and they give me business capabilities. The people who aren't in the code with me want to hear about cost and risk. And this question is framed in cost and risk. And I really like that. I think the biggest single waste in software development is a disconnect between human beings with needs. So the simplest version of that is, I'm a developer. I have a need to write code that runs well and solves a problem for somebody. A challenge in my early career was, is there any person with a face that I can see their face when they try this? No, why not? To me, that was a huge waste. I mean, think of the energy that would be pumped back into me if I saw that they loved it. Or think of the motivation that would be pumped back into me if I saw that it was almost, but they need something a little different now. Either way, I love programming for the problem solving, but it has to be somebody's problem for it to be satisfying. And then the flip side is that customer who maybe never gets to interact with the people who are working really hard to figure something out for them. You have these layers of abstraction in between, and you have these human needs that we're just like trying to approximately somehow get close to meeting sometimes. And I think that's the single biggest waste.
I'm just going to take you back to the high performance culture question, because we've had a question in the chat from Carl, which is the habitual micro improvement that you described feels like it requires a level of ownership and optimism as a starting point. Would you agree with that?
Very much so. Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you have no expectation that you'll be allowed to work in a new way, why would you try? If you have an expectation that you'd be punished for taking time to learn, thinking that it would speed you up in even the medium term, and get punished in the short term on terrible performance criteria, you're not going to do it unless you have to choose between your job and your joy. And that's exactly what we're against. So yeah, you have to have a reason to believe it could pay off.
We've got a question from Sinead on the actual talk as well. She says, do you feel it was risky adding in the feature at the last minute in the bank, considering the impact if it went wrong, or was it worth it for the relationships it improved, even though the feature wasn't required or important to the product? Did you do it for the improved communication side?
Terrific. Yeah, it wasn't zero risk, but it was a risk. Like if that question had been posed to me months before, say we were in the same situation, it was release night, it was the morning of that day, and a request came in like that, I would not have been in a position to judge that risk accurately and say we could go for it. And I wouldn't have. I would have said, no, I don't think so. And that's kind of true. I have more stories I could tell sometime. There are other ones I didn't get to tell where the risk was higher. And we had to take it anyway. And because of what had just come before, it was just mitigated enough. The project delivery is kind of an example of that. If that assignment had been given to me on day 1 or even day 100 or day 300 of my tenure in this job, it would have failed. The code wasn't in the right situation, I wasn't in the right situation, and our relationship wasn't right. But I didn't, in this case, when Bill asked, I thought, I'll try. And if we can't come up with the right test cases, we'll know, we'll just stop there. If we can't get the test to pass without breaking other stuff, we'll probably stop there. But if it can all work, then our system is probably okay. And, you know, there's no 100% in that situation, but the risk seemed pretty small. It didn't stop me in that situation. It didn't stop me.
Next one, any strategies for justifying architecture refactoring to an organization?
It's sort of a bigger version of the strategies for justifying any refactoring. Programmers day to day don't need to ask permission for refactoring because of what refactoring is. Refactoring is changing any tiny piece of code's behavior without changing what it is seen, changing the inside without changing the behavior. So inside the function or the method or the class, maybe we like better how it works. Outside the function, method, or class, nobody can tell that anything happened. That's refactoring. So architecture refactoring, just like any refactoring, the business case is in terms of cost and risk, like our earlier question. Typically, if you're going with an architecture refactoring, you have to make a case to somebody because those aren't things you can do in 15 minutes in your IDE. So you need some organizational buy-in, but the argument has to be in terms of what could go wrong if we leave it the way it is, and what's kind of our expected cost benefit of those things that could happen. Also, how would we find out if it goes wrong? This is also key. Maybe it goes wrong in a way that we find out quickly without very much damage, and then we have some options for quickly mitigating it. Then that's one thing. If it's something we'd find out after our data is entirely inconsistent a month later and we're in deep doo-doo, then you want to get that sooner. So I think the people who would want to buy into that are going to be interested in the risks and the costs.
Okay, I'm just going to take one more from the chat from Nat. And so she said, do you think that estimation can be waste? When you used Scrum and hit your deadline with 5 minutes to spare, is that because your estimates and task decomposition were really good, or did you end up in micro crunch cycles to keep you burned down chart on course?
It may be that it would have worked anyway. I don't know. I do think in general, one of the things that I used to unconditionally think was required in software development is that we make estimates about stories. I no longer believe that. And in general, any idea that I encounter, if I can't think of when I wouldn't do it, then I don't think my understanding is broad enough yet. So in this case, could we have delivered that 8-month project without doing point estimates? Maybe. At the time, it was the thing that we thought would give us the most confidence because we had no previous information on our velocity. We weren't doing stories at all, really. We weren't counting them. We didn't have any kind of any sort of numerical basis for knowing what our speed was. Our first reaction when the project came to us was to try to prove technologically that it wouldn't work and they should assign it to somebody else. And our proof of concept was that it could probably just about work. And then the next thing we had to prove is, given everything we know we have to do, is there a chance that we'll get it done on time, or is it obvious that we never could? And the only way we could find that out with the information we had at that point was, as far as we could tell, was to put points on it and see what our speed was. And I think if I had to do it over again in that context, I would do it that way again. And here's why I think so. Because of that manager that I had at the time. I think he needed to see what the burn down chart did when it had that bump, when we had our dependency try to change the plan. He needed to see that picture for him to get involved, and we needed him to get involved. So I wouldn't always do point estimates. At this point, I look for ways to not need it. But in that situation, I think I would do it that way again.
Okay. What's the number one common practice in software engineering that we need to reform or remove to be more humane to engineers?
I think it's, if I had to remove one thing, I would remove that we assign work to a single developer by default. I think it's a fine option for certain kinds of work or developers in certain frames of mind or in certain locations. We got to have an option where one person can be responsible for one piece of work, but it is not a good default option. I think it leads to a lot of other dysfunction when people are expected to be able to handle everything themselves, when there isn't review built into the development process and it has to come after, when learning is something that happens kind of on the side instead of integrated into the development process. I think all of those are bad side effects. And then, of course, the individual performance, the way that it's measured on the basis of how many whatevers you individually got done. I think all of it is bad. And if I had to remove one thing, I would change the default that we assign work to the whole team.
And last question, if you were in the market for a new role as a software developer, take yourself back a little bit, which three things would be at the top of your must-have for any potential organisation, be it team, tech stack, whichever facet or facets you would choose to prioritise?
Huh. Well, so it's not that foreign for me. As a consultant, when I read the Agile Manifesto, it says we are doing it and helping others do it. And when I was brand new to coaching, I had this vision in my head. If I ever get to do coaching, I think what I'm going to need for a long career is to switch back and forth, like it says. When I coach, I get to use what I learned. I get to share. I get to exercise other parts of myself. And then after a while, I start to wonder if I haven't been responsible for deadlines and production and support in a long time. I start to wonder if what I'm saying is still true. I wouldn't believe my own advice after too long. And then I think, wow, I really miss programming. I really miss being in a team. I really miss being my feet held to the fire. And so I like to switch. And sometime soon, I probably will be switching to programming for a little while. So I think one big lesson from my time at the bank was how insular it was there. As I was learning about Agile and XP and test driving and integration and pairing, all these things, I felt like I had to go to the internet to find it because it wasn't happening there. And they weren't sort of deliberately not connected to any community involvement. And in retrospect, that really slowed my development and made me like I had to get over a hump when I went out into the wider world to feel connected to it, because I had felt very disconnected from it in that job. So I think the most important thing, the single most important thing I would look for in a software development job now is a company that, this is going to sound really self-serving for AO today, but a company that has community involvement, that sends people to conferences, that invites speakers, that people could be interested in how they work, that they could learn from other people and other people could learn from them. I think that would be number one. About the tech stack, I think at this point in my career, I would hope not to do something I've done before, but that's not a deal breaker. It's just that there's so much I have to learn that I would love for a job to be an opportunity to learn it. And I think, you can't always know what a company does on the inside, but I would love to know that they do pair programming or mob or ensemble programming at least some of the time already. I wouldn't want to have to be the one that introduces it. I would just want to come in and take advantage of that. I think those are my 3 things.
Right. Just invite Dave back.
Thanks, Amitai. That was a great thought-provoking talk. Before this talk, I wonder how many people thought about bringing people into their retrospectives, let alone the code, to build those human relationships. Pleased to say Amitai is going to be pairing with our principal development community in the coming weeks. So we're going to try and extract some more insights and get them onto techao.com. And also watch that space for future thought leaders. I think our next topic is on data. But just wanted to end this session with a huge thanks to Amitai and all the engagement from the audience as well. Thank you very much.